Okay, I think everyone has probably joined in by now. So welcome to the UK Climate Resilience Programme webinar series. My name is Suraje Dessai. Together with Dr. Kate Lonsdale, we're the program champions. And it's our great pleasure to have today Paul Sayers and from Sayers and Partners to come and talk to us about spatially coherent flooding events across the UK. And then Mike Steele from the Environment Agency, who will provide a response to some to the research that's being undertaken. And then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A and discussion as usual. So for those of you who've been here before, you will know how to engage. We'll have the presentations first, and then the Q&A. So please post your questions on the Q&A box at any time, and you can use the upvote to pick on your favorite questions. So those get ranked further up. I mean, if time allows it, we can try to unmute you to ask the question directly to our speakers. As usual, this is the webinar is recorded, and we'll put all this on the website afterwards in our YouTube channel. If there are any technical problems, please use the chat and do use the hashtag and check out the website as well, please. So I'm just going to mention a few program news before handing over to Paul. So one piece of news is some new research from the program. So this is from the IMPRESS project led by Rachel Warren at the Tyndall Center. That was funded in the first phase of the project. A new paper came out last month that was particularly looking at evaluating heat extremes in the UK climate projections 2018, and I'm sure you'll hear about those projections soon from Paul as well. So you can see, for example, in that plot, comparisons between the different products in the UK climate projections with some of the observed data. So check out that paper that came out in Environmental Research Letters in last month. The next set of news is that the Met Office is running a hackathon. So there's still an opportunity to join this hackathon. It's co-sponsored by the UK Climate Resilience Programme, and it's got 3 themes, looking at marine and coastal, nature-based solutions, and then sustainable development at home and abroad. This will happen over 2 days, the 16th and 17th of March. It's an entirely virtual event. And if you're interested, do email that email address, cop26@metoffice.gov.uk to form a team and participate in the hackathon if you're interested in. Final piece of news is related to COP26 as well. So the COP26 Universities Group is organizing a week-long conference, a virtual conference that's going to bring in science and policy together. And there's a call for contributions on frontier adaptation and resilience research and its application to policy for a particular day that's focused on adaptation and resilience. So you can submit, individual presentations, for example, or abstracts for posters. And I've been told that the deadline is likely to be extended until the 5th of March. So the website says the 26th of March, but you're likely to have a little bit more time. So do have a look at that. So Kate Lonsdale is involved and I believe this is being led by Robert Nichols at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. So let me move on to the bulk of the webinar. So Paul Sayers is an expert in climate, flood risk, and coastal risk. He's been working on this for over 25 years. He's been particularly involved in the climate change risk assessment as well of the UK and contributing to the third one with flood risk assessment there. And Paul has also worked internationally and in the UK. So he's also part, besides this project, which is being funded by the Met Office, Paul is also involved in the Open CLIM project that's being led by the Tyndall Center, where they're trying to enhance climate change risk assessment capabilities for CCRA 4 and 5 and the future in that area. So I'll stop sharing my screen, Paul, and hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Suraj. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yep, can hear you and see you. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, first, it's a real pleasure to join the webinar series. I've been an attendee on quite a few of them, and I've enjoyed them all. So it's good to be on the other side. I just noticed that under COVID, that's why it says 2020 on the slide. I seem to have lost a year, but I guess lots of people have had a similar process. So yeah, today I'll be talking about some research exploring the spatially coherent events and widespread events across the UK. But before I do, I'll just give a quick shout out to those that have been in the project with us. The project is called AquaCat, we call it, and we're partway through the project. It hasn't yet complete, so we're seeing some of the outputs from that now, but it's not yet complete. We've got an excellent advisory group from both industry and the insurance world and the Met Office, and the team involves sales and partners leading, so I'm the lead, but with Sam Carr and Matt Horrett supporting, but also centrally CEH, Lisa Stewart and Alan Griffiths, and I'm sure you know Alison Kay and Vicky Bell, many of you, as well as Vivid Economics. So it's quite an interesting and strong team. The research objectives for the project, there's 4, and these are listed on the screen here. I'm only going to focus on 2 of those. I'm going to focus on the one that's around spatially coherent events, understanding those and how they might change in the future, and whether we can look at those from a risk perspective. But there are 2 other work streams that I won't talk about here, about the difference in frameworks between risk frameworks between the insurance sectors, the financial sectors, and the way we do it in the public sector. And also Vivid are looking at vulnerability and exposure data sets and what are most useful for the UK. But the ones I'm going to focus on today are those objectives 1 and 2 around the spatially coherent events and exploring that in a risk context. So a little bit about the motivation for the project. So we've got the excellent resource of the UK CP18 data. It's a hugely rich resource. And to date, I think it has been really well mined for quite high resolution insights into future flows at a particular site, so future flood flows at a particular location. And Alison Kay has published extensively from CEH on that, and there's relates the change and the different futures, different climate futures to change in peak flows at a location. But there has been limited, I would say, use made of it from, can it tell us something about the changing spatial coherent, i.e. widespread flood events? So, okay, there's a gap in the mining of that information, but why do we care about that? Well, I would say there's 3 core reasons why we care about spatially coherent events. That spatial interconnectedness of our world is important. Now, I was lucky enough to be part of the Foresight program led by Edward Evans, and I look back, and in there one of the notes we mention is around disruption can quickly lead to widespread and serious consequences across networks, infrastructure networks. We need to understand that if we are to improve resilience, and that's something that got reinforced again in the National Resilience Review. We also know that really floods are spatially coherent. The ones that we see are event-based. They take place in a time and across a space. But often when we're in the public sector side, we ignore that spatial correlation in the way we calculate the risks. The insurance industry, however, and the financial sectors have that as a real central tenet and have had so for some time from a present day perspective. So we remain insightful on future changes in spatial coherent events. Will they change in frequency, and what will the implications be for the way we adapt and target our resources? So a quick look at the flow of a conventional, simplified view of a conventional present day approach to an event simulation that might be used in, say, an insurance sector perspective. So you've got observed gauges, you generate from that observations some kind of stochastic event, you simulate that event, look at the footprint of the event, calculate the impact and analyze the damages. And one important element of that process is that stochastic event generation. And I've just highlighted here a Hefner and Torn method that's widely used. David Winkle used it, and Rob Lamb has used it in various papers. And the way that looks at spatial coherence is, rather than thinking just about the marginal extreme at a single location, you consider a location A, and then you fit a conditional distribution at location B based on the flow at A. And it proceeds by, you pick a location in a given spatial domain, say Y1, as the most extreme for this particular event. You set a threshold for that location. Look at the extreme flow for that threshold from its marginal distribution, and then use the conditional distribution to understand what the flow might be at location Y2 in the domain. And you can kind of see that just in an illustrative way on the right-hand plot there, that by going through that process, you now get new events, new unseen events that are both at location A and location B, or in this case, Y1 and Y2. So you can build up, if you can imagine that you're doing that across multiple locations and multiple connections, you can build up this spatially coherent event. Okay, that's broadly what's done in a present day situation, but we want, in this research, we're exploring one that looks at the future. So we're replacing that observation now, not with the gauges, but with the UK CP18 regional climate model outputs. And we have slightly changed the order of the process. So we take the climate change projections, and for those, we run a flood hazard simulation and extract events, observed events from within that climate change projection, drives from those observed events. We can then extend those using this stochastic event set approach, and then on to the same standard approaches of impacts analysis and statistical measures. So just exploding a few of those key steps. The observations, as I say, come from the UK CP18 RCM output. So that's the 12 ensemble members from the 12 kilometre daily time step data. We've got two epochs. We've got the present day 30 years time slice and a future 30-year time slice. And we've only got the RCP 8.5 projections within those regional climate models. And the reason we use the regional climate models rather than the probabilistic outputs is within those regional climate model outputs, they are spatially coherent. So that is a spatially coherent model of the climate. We have to bear in mind that although it's spatially consistent, that those models have been developed to balance various outputs, not just extreme floods or extreme spatial aspects of the floods, but a whole range of flows, largely around mean flood flows and droughts. So using that UK CP18 boundary conditions from the RCMs, we drive the grid-to-grid model, which is CEH's very well tried and tested national gridded hydrological model that covers all of Great Britain. And we've modified it, well, not modified it, but we've extracted some information from that tells us about the inundated area. in a proxy way. Where do we might think might be inundated in the absence of any defences, not including any of those things, but that gives us a flood hazard simulation that we can identify events from. And here is a couple of those, what we're calling observed events, even though they're driven from the climate model. And these are two of the largest that we see in the grid-to-grid. On the left there, covering 22% of the river network, and on the right, 23% of the river network, but quite distinctly spatially different to major events. So that gives us an observed event set that we then need to extend to a much wider population of events. And we do it in pretty much the same way as I've just spoken about on that earlier slide, but this time we're using the footprint of the whole observed event from the grid-to-grid model, and then we stochastically generate a whole series of new events, around about 5,000 additional new events for each RCM. And that is both more extreme at particular locations, that's more extreme at points, but also more extreme across space. And rather than getting into some of the real detail behind that method, I thought I'd most interestingly show some of the outputs that are coming from the calculations. So here is a comparison of the present and future number of widespread events. So how many widespread events might we expect? And on the y-axis there, you've got the number of events, and on the x-axis by just blocked by season through winter, spring, summer, and autumn. It's quite interesting that we see there's an increase in the number of widespread events that we see in winter, spring, and autumn, and less so in summer where it falls. So this isn't local events, but this is thinking about those widespread coherent events that focus here. So we thought that was really quite an interesting outcome, still in draft, still being explored, but so we're expecting to see this increase in the number of events that fall in that widespread category. We can also be looking at that from, is there a change in duration associated with those widespread events? So the top four are present day and the bottom are future. And this is, again, on the x-axis is increasing duration of the event, and on the y-axis, the spatial scale of the event. And they're similar, but we can see, particularly in winter, that widespread events are becoming more persistent. So they're lasting for longer. We can see that. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but we can see that in around here. And the coloured up, just again to just orientate yourself, the colours show the number of events that are within that band. So that provides us a set of underlying hazard events. But what we need to do to understand the risk, of course, is to convert those to some form of event damage. And the way we're doing that is we are drawing an event from that spatially, that stochastic hazard event set. That was just illustrated on the previous plots. We draw one of those events, and it might look like this. So in this case, we've got a strongly focused event around East Anglia. And then we convert it to a damage. And the way we're doing that is using the Future Flood Explorer, which is the model that underlies the climate change risk assessment flood projections. We're only using it for the moment in direct damage mode, so only direct damages to properties, not interconnected damages. So we get an event damage. And then we can say, draw another event and have a look at the expected annual or seasonal annual events, or an extreme annual event risk. So what is the 100-year flood damage? But we can have to go around that cycle until those statistics converge. So we have to keep drawing another event and calculating those damages until it stabilizes on whatever statistic we want, i.e. the expected annual damage, or the expected winter damage, or expected summer damage, or the 1 in 100-year damage, or the 1 in 10-year damage from a UK or an England perspective, or any other aggregation perspective. Just to illustrate, this is an illustration of some early output, but for each event, each one of those spatial events, in this case, event 1 to 20, we can see that has different damages, and it's assigned a different part of the season. So then we can take a mean of those to try and get our mean expected annual damage, but we would have to keep sampling, which is the process we're currently in the middle of. You have to keep sampling until that converged. I can, if all being well, I can try and show you how that is progressing on this plot, which I'm hoping you can see. So this is the events, so just some sampled events, in this case events, just 20 events it's cycling through, but you can see that you get quite different spatial distributions of where the highest flows are and the greatest flood outlines are. So that's with the blue, the darker the blue, the more severe the event is at that location. And if you can see the light green and then the very light dots, you're still getting flooding in some of those areas, or high flows in some of those areas. And periodically you get that really quite extreme event. And then if I flip to damages, we can see where the damage is taking place within those spatially coherent events. And what's quite interesting is those two things don't align, of course. You don't expect your worst damage necessarily to correspond with your highest flows. Sometimes they do, but because of defences and the where properties are on the floodplain, etc., they can be quite different. So you're getting one view from the spatial distribution of the hazard, and then a slightly different view from when you start translating that hazard to risk. And that one is the slide that I've just shown you on the event damages. We're also charged in AquaCat to think not just about how you calculate a risk under climate change, but can we pull together the demands of what might be needed from a public sector perspective around adaptation and socioeconomic change. For example, I attended the Cambridge Econometrics view on the socioeconomic futures. And it's quite easy to see how that process changes the risks that we would see here. So in the FFE, we can modify adaptation to change the impact, and we could also influence the grid-to-grid model to change hydrological adaptations, and socioeconomic impacts can also be featured in there. So it's quite an easy processing chain to think about how you could start exploring adaptation and how that adaptations might change the risks from a spatial event perspective. Okay, just some concluding thoughts from me based on where we've got to so far. Firstly, around how useful the climate CP18 data is to drive the grid-to-grid and generate that event simulation of the hazard. Well, I think that's already showing us some quite interesting outputs, actually. This idea that the number of widespread events increases in the future, particularly in the summer. Sorry, except in the summer where it falls. and this idea that winter events, large-scale, widespread winter events, are more persistent for longer in the future. Also seems interesting. I haven't put anything in this presentation about this next bullet point, but I thought I'd put it in next. We've explored it a little bit, but wasn't really time here. You might have picked up that we are focused on the RCP 8.5 outputs. We have tried to explore a little bit about whether a bias correction would be important. Doesn't seem to be that important from a spatial structural perspective, which was an interesting finding, but another more detailed talk. And then what can we conclude about the event-based climate risk and adaptation assessment that we've embedded in the Future Flood Explorer? Well, there are lots of events when you move to the future. There's obviously 12 ensemble members, all with lots of events to be simulated. So it needs to be super efficient in the way you sample that and calculate the damage. So there's definitely a requirement there. And then if you overlay that with adaptation choices and socioeconomic choices, that's going to be important. But we are seeing there is a reason to do that, because that high hazard and high damage may or may not be spatially correlated. So you need to understand that. Next steps. So as I say, we're in process. The research is in process, hasn't completed yet. So we'll be continuing the work in the coming months. And we've got various papers in train. But it's also really quite interesting, I think, that the works is really at the start. It's not really at the end. There's a whole series of things that it would be great to try and incorporate around network distribution, other sources of hazards, etc., to explore how the structure of future events might influence national investment. So a lot of interesting things hopefully will come down the line. That's my final quick whistle-stop 20-minute tour of the AquaCat project. So I shall pass over back to Suraje.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. That was very interesting research, and the questions are coming in. So do please continue putting your questions on the Q&A box. But before we go into discussion, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mike Steele. Mike is responsible for the Environment Agency's long-term investment scenarios for flood and coastal risk management. And previously, he worked on national flood risk assessment and also plans to manage flood risk in the Thames estuary until the 2100. You might be aware of the Thames Estuary 2100 project. So he's very qualified to respond to this research. So Mike, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Paul, for the presentation. So some response to me from an Environment Agency perspective. Quite briefly, there's a lot here, so it's quite difficult to know where to focus really. But I think you're looking back at what we do. Paul mentioned that in historically in a sort of day job operational role of the Environment Agency, a lot of our information is local information for local decisions about investment decisions, local flood defence schemes and development advice. And a lot of our work and operations is about reducing risk to communities and the new focus of increasing their resilience. So that's going to remain. But what it does mean is that it's currently quite hard for us to answer some of these spatially coherent or widespread flowing questions now, let alone thinking about future climate. These did come to the fore in the National Flood Resilience Review, and they haven't gone away. They're important questions, and if we could answer them, there's definitely some things we could improve. So I think the simplest and most obvious question is this one around what's the chance of a big flood or a big loss somewhere in England each year? At the moment, we tend to talk about properties protected and reduction in expected annual damages when we outline the outcomes of our investment programme, or considering a certain investment scenario in our long-term investment scenarios. Expected annual damages gives us a good headline summary, but it wraps up a whole lot of information about the range of flooding from frequent flooding through to catastrophic. So it's not very tangible. It's hard to bring out the fact that we expect to see lots of small floods each year. There's also a good chance of a big flood in England each year. Paul mentioned previous work that quantifies that. So from a LTIS, long-term investment scenarios perspective, and the investment side in particular, that I'm working on at the moment, we want to describe how investment should reduce likelihood impacts of floods, and in particular with the move to talking about resilience, focusing on the impacts, not just the likelihood. So the spatial coherence perspective can help us say more about the benefits of our investment, either in terms of the probability of a certain level of damages each year, or the damages associated with a certain probability, which then raises the question, what will climate change do to this? And that's where it's quite difficult, and the richer information that Paul's presented could be very, very useful and interesting. So what could different types of investment achieve? Some might be better at reducing the impacts of frequent flooding, others to reduce the impacts from catastrophic flooding. Knowing how the risks change in the long term may change your investment policy over time. How do different levels of investment achieve? What sort of investment do you need to prevent damages increasing, either say for a specific probability range or across the board? And I think all these help inform a discussion and debate about what is acceptable or tolerable in terms of levels of risk and resilience, which we can have a limited debate about at the moment in terms of the current climate, but bringing in the future climate will be really important. Other things going forward in terms of how we can use this information. So we're working on a new National Flood Risk Assessment. NAFRA 2 is the acronym. The scope doesn't currently include spatial coherence, but it's being designed to enable that as a future improvement, and that would then enable us to use it within our long-term investment scenarios. I think it's also quite interesting to think about the operational side, and in particular, incident management, flood incident management and emergency planning, where it could have implications for our operations teams. So thinking about the chance of flooding in multiple catchments in a winter flood season. Will a winter flood season become more defined? Those initial results suggest maybe. Thinking about the chances of surges on east and south coasts and whether that would change in the future. And what does that mean to what we do? So in terms of our activities, ramping up early, moving staff and resources around the country. We already share staff across regions, and we have assets like pumps and temporary barriers, which we move around the country. So that's quite a big operational deal, and how we do that effectively could be guided by some of this. How all these change with climate change. So in particular, the seasonality question, whether there's a greater east-west difference across England over time, how that would change how we manage flood events. And then finally, I wanted to mention communication, because there's a lot of impressive statistics involved in this work, but arguably the bigger challenge might be in communicating this new information. It brings a lot of new extra information into the picture, but that could completely confuse people who are used to a sort of traditional event-based analysis. Communication of risk already has its challenges. I think we've seen some improvements with a move away from talking about return periods to talking about annual probabilities. But still, we know that communicating to the public, quoting probabilities isn't particularly helpful, and it's better to talk about the magnitude of previous floods. So if we've got more information here, richer information, but the risk of overlapping or duplicating language, particularly in terms of probabilities, how do we manage that? A lot of the traditional language focuses on the probability of something in a place as opposed to in a region or the whole country. So I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's quite important looking forwards. Finally, I mentioned guidance. We currently have guidance for appraisal and planning processes, which sets out changes to river flows and rainfall at regional catchment scales. What does this, what extra could we bring into there from this work? And my final point, at the risk of confusing myself, but how could this link to how we manage non-stationarity, how we consider non-stationarity in our decisions would be another interesting opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Mike. I don't know, Paul, whether you have any immediate reactions to any of these final comments that Mike had on non-stationarity before I go to the other questions.
Well, only they're all very good points that Mike was making. From non-stationarity perspective, it certainly gives us a view on that idea that the number of widespread events are changing. So that might have implications, as Mike was saying, for our incident management response or other actions. So it certainly adds, I think it can add another dimension to what we understand about the non-stationarity, because it's thinking about that potential influence of the widespread events also being non-stationary. But tricky to incorporate into that guidance.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions from Hayley Fowler. So Hayley, I'm gonna allow you to talk so you can ask the question directly. Do you want to give that a go? We can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm on my phone having my lunch. So, okay. I had a couple of questions, Paul. It's really interesting work. And I think it'll be really interesting to try and repeat it with the very high resolution CPM data when it's ready. But one, I was interested in your.
We've lost you.
Comment about the bias in the flood events or the storms. Wondered how you'd actually managed to assess that. And my second point was really that, I mean, I think it's interesting that you find this persistence increase in the winter and autumn storms, because that's something we've really found in both the observations and in previous work with regional climate models. I was wondering whether you'd looked at all at the clustering in time of the storms and whether that's changing, because I think that's a really important aspect, as well as the spatial dimensions. And that's it.
That sounds enough. Yeah, thanks for that. Hey, there, definitely agree that it's an interesting combination. It would be really interesting to think about that high resolution data when it's available. It would be really good to use. From the bias correction, that's only a bit of an initial work that we've had a look at on not in as much detail as we would like to yet. So it was just an initial conclusion. So I don't think it's super detailed in how we've looked at that. Adam Griffiths is on the line. He might want to dive into the detail of that a bit more. So it is tricky. I think understanding how that influences what we see is tricky, but we've had a bit of a go. The persistence question, I think, is interesting that you also have seen that. So that's an interesting point, because I don't think that's really yet well known or used. Clustering and the time sequencing in space, an effect on flooding. There's two bits to that. One is, yes, clustering in the sense of, are there changes in the number of events that we might see in a year, the number of how they might be distributed across the seasons. So from that perspective, sort of a high aggregation of the clustering. In terms of particular storm sequences and whether one event is also correlated with the next event, we haven't looked at that. That would be, that's a really nice thing to do, and it would be a really interesting thing to do, but we haven't looked at that, the autocorrelations between the individual events. But nonetheless, we can still say something about the general distribution of events through the year.
I've brought in Adam in case he wants to add and maybe address. Paul Bates has a question about, you know, have you bias corrected the UKCP 18 data?
Yeah, so this is an interesting point. So to start off with, we've only really looked at whether to use this bias correction in terms of its effect on extreme flooding. So we haven't looked at the storm events themselves. But the idea was we use the kind of present day slice of UKCP, the present day slice of observed data, and so there's 1980 to 2010, and the equivalent slice from the UKCP 18 data. We compared the relative estimates of the flood frequency generated from the UKCP 18 data through the grid model and the observed data. And we found that actually the bias correction seemed to reduce the, compared to, we tried with and without bias correction, and we found that using the bias correction reduced the accuracy of the flood frequency estimates compared to observed data. So for this project, we haven't used the bias correction, although we did look into it.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Peter Watson has asked a couple of questions, so I also wanted to give him the opportunity to ask it directly to our speakers. Peter.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, so my first question is, does your damages that you were talking about include only the financial costs, or are there also other social impacts that can be estimated, like the number of properties or people who have flooded?
Yeah, so at the moment we've just looked at the, we're just calculating the damage from an economic damage perspective to residential and non-residential homes, but it is, the model is capable of pushing out the number of properties, number of people, socially disadvantaged groups, a whole series of impacts in the same way. I don't know if you've looked at the UK climate change risk assessment set of metrics that we use in the flood analysis, but effectively it can produce those same metrics. But for the moment, we're just focusing on expected, damage to residential and non-residential property.
Great. Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see the kind of full analysis. So the second question I had was, I mean, you said you were interested in looking at quantities like the 100-year return periods, damages, and I was wondering, is the amount of climate simulation data you have a limitation in that? It would seem like to get an estimate with quite low sampling variability, you'd need a couple of thousand years of simulation data. So I was just wondering, have you tried to quantify the sampling data, the sampling variability associated with how much climate simulation data you have? Or have any idea how big that is?
Adam might also have a view on that too, but we are, for each event step, we try and calculate this, a large sample from the 30-year sample of climate data for each RCM. And then we try and extrapolate that to a whole series of flood events, around about 5,000 events. We try and, it's new events we generate from that. And then from sampling that large number, we think we can then pull out a 100-year event also. We haven't yet explored the uncertainty introduced, if you like, from that sampling from that small set of the climate observed data set. Adam might want to have a comment on that.
Yeah, so I think Paul's mostly answered that. The idea being with these two methods is that we can explore essentially a little bit beyond the climate data that we do have. By fitting the models appropriately, we kind of can fill in those gaps to get to kind of explore those tails and have an idea of what a more extreme event, what those more extreme events might look like. And so the idea being that then essentially we do have, in quotes, thousands of years of simulated events.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Yes.
There are some of us in atmospheric science trying to work on making much larger climate simulation data sets. So yeah, maybe that would be something interesting to link up in.
Yeah,
future.
that would be.
Oh, yeah,
that would be.
Great, thanks very much, Peter and Paul and Adam. I've got a question here from Oliver Wing. A 1 kilometre resolution flood model of the UK with no flood defences must surely struggle to get at the damages and impacts locally in any meaningful way. What do you therefore see as the potential uses for this data set? It's be good to get both your
yeah. So so we only use the 1 kilometre resolution grid to grid to see where there is a potential for a flood. So to give some idea of the potential footprint, that then allows us to say that's a potential widespread event. We're not saying anything about its damage based on that 1 kilometre grid. We then use that event to say, well, what is the return period of the flow at that each point within that network, within that widespread event, and then that drives a risk calculation using the Future Flood Explorer that has the defences in there, has a much more resolved floodplain impact representation. So the 1 kilometre is just to understand how the flow is behaving in that widespread event, not how the risk is behaving in that widespread event.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Do you want to comment on the use, Mike, there?
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Okay, no worries. So next question we've got, and you've touched upon it a little bit, is just, you know, how do you sort of define widespread? So Claire's asking, how widespread does the flood need to be considered widespread in your analysis?
Well, that one actually has, because we do tell it what widespread is. So that has, it has to be above 0.5% of the grid squares in the grid have to be above a certain threshold. So it has a threshold component and a widespread minimum threshold.
We're looking at a river network of about 20,000 square kilometres. So if we're just focusing on the river network itself, that's about 20,000 square kilometres. And so 0.5% is, at least 40 square kilometres.
Yeah, thanks. And we have played around with that number, so that's controllable. So that's controllable. So if for example, as Hayley was suggesting, we went to the very high resolution rainfall type surface water, you'd probably have you would obviously use different criteria for that. But that's set, and that's what we can modify it, but that's the one we're using at the moment. Yeah, so 0.5% of those grid points are above a threshold.
Okay, thanks, Paul. There's another question here about, it's moving around now. Where is it? And are there any initial ideas that might explain why the overall number of widespread events decreases only in the summer in the simulation?
No is the short answer for that, in the sense we haven't explored that yet to see if that is if Jason was on the call, I'm sure he would have a view from that, because that's coming from the climate model itself, from the UK CPA team, largely coming from that.
The good news is I believe Jason is now online, actually.
So. Look at that, he's joined just at the correct. He's probably thinking, what is that question about?
Yeah, I've literally just joined from an EU meeting. I mean, what we're seeing in the driving model is there are some quite noticeable changes in atmospheric circulation, and you see that in both the summer and winter. I suspect it's probably linked to a change in the circulation type you're seeing, but we need to look in more detail to really understand that, I think.
Which is nice actually, because that's kind of a finding that isn't directly obvious to everyone. So that's quite from a research perspective, that's quite nice.
Simon Brown's got a technical question here a little bit about whether the copula and the Hefferman and Thorne stochastic model, has that been published?
So the Hefferman and Thorne is published and is you know, widely used. The empirical coupler that we're applying here is in the process of being published. But as the overall approach is, yeah, we do have a few papers in train, not yet out. They will all be published. We hope.
It's a good question here about, you know, have you done any sort of validation of the events generated?
Interesting question. That is really hard, as we know, to validate. Probabilistic kind of event sets. And what we have done is, for part of the CCRA, in fact, was look at whether we get the right damage for some historical events. So we've taken the 2007 widespread flood event that was widely explored in terms of how many properties it affected, what the damage was, etc. And then had a look at whether, if we took that distribution of flows, what would we estimate to be the damage? So that part is more appropriate or more able for validation, i.e. because there was an event, we know what the damage was. If we put that event into the Future Flood Explorer, do we get the same kind of damage? Which has been interesting. It's much more difficult to validate whether the event set is right or not. Local flow prediction, so lots of the grid to grid has been widely compared to flows in lots of processes. So that part has also been validated. But are those events that we're generating representative of the distribution of events is really difficult to determine.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Definitely an area of continued research that I think.
I had a question about how you create the 5,000 events. So, because I think you said that for each, because you've got 12 ensembles from the regional climate models, but then you're creating 5,000 events for each one of those ensembles. How do you create those 5,000 events?
So the idea with exactly in the Hefferman and Thorne, you fit essentially a parametric model to the observed data set that we're getting straight out of the grid-to-grid model. And so from that parametric model, you essentially can draw as many new events as you like out of the bag, and they will match the same distribution, the same spatial coherent structure as the observed. And so, but the idea is you'll be able, each event is drawn kind of using different random seeds, so that you might be able to explore the tails of the distribution a bit more in the observed data set. So essentially, you can generate as many events as you can generate random numbers, really. And the same is true of the empirical coupler method, which is a little bit simpler in that we essentially take one of the events from the distribution and apply a order preserving noise to the return periods at each grid point. The idea being the overall shape is preserved, but maybe the peaks get higher and the spread gets wider or narrower. And yeah, again, that's down to essentially we use the data set itself as the kind of distribution of spatial structure, and to get the actual tails of the distribution, we have a very simple beta distribution based on the data set. And so just drawing as many number centimeter meters distribution as we need to attach to the spatial structure means we can generate as many as we want. 5,000 was just a number we picked so that you'd be able to see 5 1 and 1,000 year events.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm going to take one final question and ask of it for both Mike and Paul, and it's Barry's question around confidence limits. I mean, are there some limits? And because it relates to Mike's point about communicating risk and uncertainty. So, I mean, to what extent, are there some confidence limits with predictions or projections around future flooding? We could get both your views on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a core question. For me, I think the thing that you most important is the confidence on the choice that you're making. Because if you add uncertainties, you can sort of, in the bringing them together sense, you can suddenly start thinking, well, actually, I've got massive uncertainty. It's all a waste of time. Because of climate's uncertain, the process is uncertain, the performance of defence is uncertain, and you end up with this. You have the potential to think, "Oh, it's just I don't know anything." But Colin Green, I don't know if everyone remembers Colin Green, excellent chap from Middlesex University. He said to me many years ago that the only uncertainty there is your rational doubt over the choice you're making. So I think that's the important point here, that we are able to look at a whole series of events and explore a whole series of different climate futures, which all have some uncertainty in them. But actually what you choose to invest in and where you choose to invest, or what you choose to do about it, might be exactly the same, regardless of those uncertainties. So I think what this helps do by linking the hazard and the risk together is we don't have a calculation process that does the hazard and puts an uncertainty on that hazard and then does the risk and does an uncertainty on the risk. But it allows you to propagate through a whole series of individual events that both hazard and damage, and then you can take a view on the confidence around that, and importantly, if your decisions would be any different. So I don't know if that helped answer it.
Do you want to add anything there, Mike, on this one?
That's a good view in terms of it's the decision that's important at the end of the day. I think in some of these results, there's absolute figures and there's relative changes, and so I think we'd have more confidence in the relative changes in the direction of change. So that's probably the easiest way of considering how they can inform decisions. It comes back to that validation question again to some extent. I wondered whether there's work on the insurance side who work with a lot of these large data sets to validate that we could learn perhaps.
Mike's response reminded me also, we have thought about, although haven't done, is explore the sensitivity of the modelling approach to different assumptions that we're making. So to try and understand which aspects of that modelling change through to risk are influencing that assessment of risk most, so that you can start identifying where are the key most sensitive parameters in that process. So then again, that helps you direct your effort to where you might think of improving it or putting greater effort to understanding it. Because if it's having no influence on the end risk, if it's not sensitive to that parameter, then we can do less. And at the moment, we don't really know which parameters it's most sensitive to.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, Mike, and Adam also for joining us. It's been a fascinating webinar, and thanks for all the questions and answers that we got. I'd like to just briefly advertise the next couple of webinars that we've got planned in the series. So we're actually continuing the flooding theme. So in 2 weeks' time, we've got Harriet Orr and Alex Cutler. We're going to come and talk to us. They're Mike's colleagues at the Environment Agency, and they're going to come and talk to us about climate resilience and the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy for England. And then the last one before Easter, we've got Mike Davis from University College London, who's going to come and talk to us about overheating in care homes. So if you go to our website, you can register for these webinars. And thank you very much for attending, and hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.